I'm really happy to be here. It's a pleasure to see you all. Today I'm going to talk, my talk is called Gazing into the Eye of the Monster / Machine, which will make more sense as we get into it. But I'm Jasmine Bina. I'm a cultural futurist and a brand strategist, and my work focuses on understanding where culture is headed before those signals become more obvious and more on the surface of culture. And a lot of what I study is uncertainty. So the strange, unstable moments when society stops behaving the way that we expect it to. And right now, I think we could easily say that we're in one of those moments today. Systems that once felt stable are behaving in ways that feel contradictory or surreal, sometimes even disturbing. And I want to say up front, this might not be the typical kind of talk that you get at CMU, but today I want to offer you a framework for at least understanding what is happening in the world. So just a little bit more about me. I'm the co-founder of Exposure Therapy, which is a community for strategists and creatives where we study the edges of culture to see what new signals are coming through. And I'm also the co-founder of Concept Bureau, which is an agency for organizations and brands that need to move the needle of culture. And in my work, I am always taking the temperature of culture. And here's what I know right now. Something is very wrong in the world. And I know everyone in this room feels it, but the people outside of this room are not talking about it. I think we can all sense that. They're not talking about it the way that they should be. And there's this presence that plagues us, and I think it's best described as this two-headed beast. And this is based on the years of qualitative research I've done, all the cultural research that I do. It's like a beast with two faces, and one face is a monster that grows by consuming. And the other face is like a machine that functions by numbing. So the monster side is about growth, a very violent growth. It grows just for the sake of growing, and it's going to consume or destroy anything in its way. We look at the Epstein files on the Department of Justice site and read and see really awful, deplorable things. And then we see Pam Bondi at a congressional hearing talking about how the Dow is over 50,000. And this is what I mean by the monster side of this beast. It's a system that accumulates value and image and power, even in the presence of moral horror. We're living in a K-shaped economy, which I'm sure you're all familiar with at this point, where the middle class is increasingly eating through its savings to survive. So this chart on the right is how we're at a record number of people withdrawing due to hardship circumstances from their 401ks. On the left is an article that went viral a few months ago about how, yeah, GDP looks like it's growing, but not really. If you just take out the demand for data centers for AI, GDP has remained flat. And yet, luxury home prices and luxury goods and luxury credit cards and premium airlines, they just keep growing. In almost every corner of the economy right now, it is easier to sell luxury than it is to sell budget, if you can just feel that for a moment. This monster doesn't care whether gains are widely shared. It only cares that this chart continues up and to the right. The other face of this beast is the machine. So the machine is the side that asks you to repress your humanity, to quash your impulse for caring for others, to invert your emotions. This head of the beast shows up when we see wars and genocide unfolding in real time. But at the same time, politics is turned into spectacle with crude jokes printed on merch. Real people suffer through forest fires and floods and landslides and all kinds of natural disasters. But sometimes, if you're lucky, you can bet on those natural disasters on Kalshi or Pally Market. And this machine creates this kind of moral distance. It turns suffering into an interface. So this is the monster / machine that I'm talking about. It shows up in every industry. It shows up in every tier of culture. And it's basically a system that has become so distorted in its incentives that now it is doing the opposite of what it was designed to do in the first place. And whatever we're looking for as a culture, it's not going to be found in this paradigm. But the most important thing to know about the monster / machine is that it wants you to look away. It wants you to keep moving and pretend like nothing is wrong. Because if you pause for even a moment to look at this with clear eyes, you would see this is very unsustainable. And that's why you might feel crazy sometimes. I talk to students. Students feel like they are going crazy. Because while all of this is going on and we witness all these insane things, we continue like everything is fine. But everything is not fine. People are changing in some really fundamental ways because of all of this. They're changing in ways you might not see yet, but they're laying the groundwork for the next paradigm that we're moving into as a culture, and it's going to look different than this one. Antonio Gramsci once wrote, "The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters." So I'm not the first person to call it a monster. I'm definitely not the first person to call it a machine, but this is exactly the moment that we're living through. And what interests me most is not necessarily the monster/machine. What interests me is what people do in response, because that tells us where the future is headed. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Many of the norms that structured modern life are weakening right now in this paradigm. So the nuclear family, the career ladder, the promise of stable middle-class prosperity, when the foundations that once supported the norms disappear because of the monster/machine, something really interesting starts to happen. Things that used to be marginal suddenly become very viable. And one way to understand this is through an economic principle called an asymmetry flip. So to put it simply, every system has a bottleneck, right? And you might usually see that bottleneck like through supply and demand, but it's in every system. And it's a constraint that limits what people can do. But when that bottleneck moves or flips, all of the rules of the game change. And for a long time, the bottleneck in culture was our social norms. Certain ways of living were simply not acceptable, right? But now as that constraint weakens, we start to see these experiments that are multiplying. Do the ladies here know about the 4B movement? I'm hoping that you do. So 4B is a South Korean feminist movement that is really gaining steam. It's traveled through Australia into the US. It's actually moving across the world. It started in 2018 as a protest in South Korea against violence against women and misogyny and gender inequality. And it's based on the 4 refusals, which are the 4 Bs. So no marriage, no childbirth, no dating, and no sex. And like I said, it's really catching on like wildfire. And if you do know 4B, you've heard their statements too. I'm just going to read one of their statements. "I will not give birth to a life that will discriminate against my gender. My own flesh and blood must not become a blade and turned against me. If the world born from my body oppresses me, I will not let that world exist." Are any of you familiar with this, the bonobo attack that happened? Right, you know what I'm talking about. So this went viral because a few months ago, a handful of female bonobos attacked and killed a male that was threatening one of the babies. And this was a big deal because we largely have observed bonobos to be peaceful creatures. And a lot of people sent this to me. There's kind of like this half lighthearted discussion about maybe the natural order of the world is changing. But it was like an initial spark that became part of a larger conversation around the idea of matriarchy. The discourse around matriarchy, especially among Gen Z and millennials, is growing right now. And more people are talking about it in deeper ways than just the fact that matriarchy centers children, which it does. Matriarchy does center children. But both men and women are talking about matriarchal systems, and they're having real and meaningful discussions about what matriarchy could actually look like in the world today. And people are starting matriarchal organizations and clubs and communities. We're already seeing the rise of mommunes. So this is a picture from a mommune, where single mothers raise children together in a home. And we're seeing the rise of female communes. There's one that I actually just saw written up called The Nest in Texas, which is for retired women and mothers. And people are creating these spaces with very different rules. People are marrying and divorcing differently. So this one requires some resources, but there's this growing trend of a nesting divorce, where the children stay in the home, but it's the parents that come and go. And that creates some sort of continuity and cohesion for the family. There's also been a lot more open embracing of things like platonic love and platonic marriages. And polyamory, of course, I could give you 50 slides on polyamory and how it's exploding, but polyamory is experiencing a renaissance as well. Men are also experimenting with new relational structures. There are many organizations like this one, but this is just one of them. It's called Men's Shed, where men gather together to work and talk and to build relationships while they're actually building things. And it actually saves lives. There are so many groups like this. There's another one called Everyman that I like to mention just because, I know somebody on the board and I know the ethos behind that company, but it's another group for bringing men together to have a different kind of intimate relational experience that is platonic and meaningful. And all of this is kind of like a response to the male loneliness epidemic that the monster/machine has kind of accelerated. But all of these are attempts to rebuild forms of connection that maybe we lost in our modern systems. And what's interesting is when we suspend the norms of marriage and children, when we stop drawing lines around what kind of relationships are allowed to experience connection and intimacy, or when we rethink who gets centered in a community, so much creative possibility and joy and happiness and respect suddenly opens up. Gen Z has also been forced to rethink many of their norms, but one in particular that often gets misunderstood is their life strategy. So Jean Twenge is a researcher who does generational research. She's remarkable. She does a lot of research for Jonathan Haidt. I was lucky enough to interview her for exposure therapy, and she presents this idea of the slow life strategy. So before, we had a fast life strategy as a culture. You're going to die young, so have a lot of kids, make your money early. Life was accelerated. But we're living longer now. We're living healthier lives for a longer time now. And stuff's taking longer. Education is taking longer. Being able to afford a house, all these milestones, they're taking longer. And so we take longer to do things because life is stretched out, including leaving our parents' homes. And this slow life strategy of staying in your parents' home through your 20s, possibly even your 30s, and not leaving as soon as you turn 18, is perhaps a really smart calculation of resources and time that makes sense. The slow life strategy makes sense when you look at it this way. And it breaks apart these old norms we have about when you're supposed to leave, and these norms that force children to leave perhaps earlier or sooner than they're prepared for. With this asymmetry flip and the suspension of all these cultural norms around how you're supposed to live a life, we see a huge explosion of people also experimenting with how they experience certain life phases or certain transitions in life. This is an image from a grief retreat in Arizona. There are grief retreats everywhere now, by the way. All kinds of retreats for life stages. There are divorce retreats and menopause retreats. And people are creating these new sacred pockets of time where they can feel an emotion very intensely. People want to deeply feel in a way that the old life model just didn't allow for. And as we continue to prototype these new lives without the pressure of norms holding us back, people are opting out of some really old systems. So throughout the continuum of wealth and income right now, I can show you at every class level, there is an escape fantasy, a fantasy around exiting society. And you could probably filter yourself somewhere along this line. So if you're working class, it might be tiny homes or an off-grid cabin. If you're middle class, maybe it's van life or boat life or digital nomadism. If you make a little more money, it might be a homestead or an eco-villa or a self-sustaining ranch. And if you're very high net worth, you still have the same exit fantasies, but those look like private islands or apocalypse shelters. We are literally opting out of and experimenting with the notion of what home actually is, of what a sense of place actually is. Work itself is also being redesigned. So the old promise was simple, right? You work hard, you stay loyal to a company, stability will follow. I think some of that still follows us. But people have a hard time really trusting that story anymore. For many people, the monster/machine has made this story impossible. And instead, people are creating portfolio careers. So perhaps it's part-time work, along with some gig and contract, along with being a creator. But each of these forms of work comes with a different set of trade-offs and risks and opportunities. And I've attempted to kind of map them here. But these squiggly lines are always moving. People still have a perception that full-time work is the safest, which is that dot to the far right at the very top. But they're also seeing that layoffs are not a glitch, they're actually a feature. And we're seeing more and more that the market rewards companies for doing big layoffs, because when you do layoffs, it's seen as leadership and decisiveness. But the market will also reward you for aggressive growth where you're over-hiring, because it's seen as a growth strategy. And instead of trying to limit this seesaw between over-hiring and layoffs, companies embrace this strategy. And you can see that really puts pressure on this idea of full-time work being something that's higher in safety or more stable. So even though employment might feel more stable, I can tell you that that line is going to start changing. That pressure now is forcing people to innovate. So you may have heard of UBI, Universal Basic Income. You might have heard of UBS, Universal Basic Services. Maybe you've heard of negative taxation. These are all really big proposals for how we're going to fix the future of work on the horizon. But people like Yancey Strickler here aren't waiting, and they're proposing new ideas right now, like the A Corp. So the A Corp is an artist corporation that he designed, where essentially instead of selling your art or your work once, you maintain value, or you continue to get value from it throughout the lifetime of that work. And it's done through collectives and cooperatives, and everybody mutually benefits from this model. And it would be an actual legal entity too. And this is what I want to tell you. So much is happening. There is a lot happening. And this asymmetry flip in our culture has removed a lot of the norms that were bottlenecking the way that we could live. And now if you know where to look, you would see that all these experiments are emerging. And what I want to tell you as designers or innovators, or if you're a builder in this room, is that even though we are in a time of incredible openness, people are still waiting for that last bit of permission. They're waiting for that last nudge, because those norms had a chokehold on us for a long time, and they still haunt us. So if you want to help build a new world, or to accelerate the new world that's coming in, you have to design systems and ideas and narratives and products that really give people permission to try new things. You have to give people new mental models for what a good life is, for what work is, for what family is, for what companionship is. And that is what will invite people into this new reality. But giving people permission is a classic design problem, right? So you guys already know how to do this, but I just really want to underscore the fact that this is perhaps the most powerful thing you could do right now when it comes to our culture. Now, another thing that we see with the monster/machine is a weakening of our institutions. So all of those side-by-side examples, the dark examples I gave you in the beginning of this conversation, those were really just examples of the institutions that we once relied on having become weakened or compromised. And what that has created is new channels of power to emerge. Because if we can't count on our old institutions, human nature is that we're going to create new pathways. Some of them are pretty developed. Some of them are still pretty informal. But they all organize and benefit our lives in a way that we want. Now, to understand the way power spreads, we have to understand something called the power law. You may have heard of this. It's also called the 80-20 rule. In many systems, a small minority produces the majority of impact. So typically, it actually breaks down to 20% of the participants in a population shape 80% of the outcomes. And it's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It could definitely be manipulated. But this is a human nature thing, because we tend to consolidate power, and because this is the way the future usually comes, it's not spread out evenly across society. It begins in concentrated pockets. And I'm going to give you a quick example of when I was reminded of this. And I think it'll really bring the 80-20 rule to life for you. So when tariffs were announced last year, I assumed the economy would slow down. Because why wouldn't the economy slow down, right? The economy, or the market, is a reflection of the people, right? So when you see that first dot, I took my retirement savings 401k and I moved it from stocks to cash. But the market did not fall. The market continued. It kept moving up. And I missed out on all that upside potential. And what I realized later is that this is the power law at play. And there's actually a statistic. I thought the market was a representation of the public, but it's not. 10% of people own 87% of stocks. That is a perfect example of the power law, where a small minority controls the majority of the value. And that 10% was not worried about tariffs. They knew they were going to be fine. So they didn't have a sell-off. The market continued to grow. Now, I'm going to show you some things that might not look like the power law on the surface, but I'm going to explain to you why they are and what that means for building the future. Another thing you might not be seeing, but it is really taking off, is the idea of agricultural living, also known as agrihoods. And this is a booming business. So there are new projects around the world where there are regular housing developments or neighborhood developments. They look normal from the outside, except that there is a farm in the middle of them. And the entire community lives like they would normally live, except they time bank some of their time to help manage this farm. And the farms can be very successful, by the way. They can spin off businesses, they can sell goods. That's not the point of them, but that does happen. And when it does, it's just more support for the community. But the point of the farm is to create a new locus of power, a new source of meaning for the community, where people can come together and contribute to something, contribute to the group as a whole. And these agrihoods exist everywhere. They're all over the US. There's Serembe in Georgia, Fox Point Farms in California, Willowsford in Virginia, Armistead in Tennessee. But they also exist in other countries. We have Musa in Mexico, and Alegria Village in Costa Rica, and La Havera in Panama. There's a great creator, by the way, named Same Travels, who covers this trend. If you're interested, I highly recommend following her stuff. But there's also a correlated boom around intentional co-living, where, again, these might look like regular neighborhoods or regular housing departments from the outside, but they're governed internally by really strong communal principles. So La Borda, on the left here in Barcelona, actually on their website you'll see this is a housing development that runs on feminist principles. They're very clear about that. Marmalade Lane in Cambridge on the right is all about enmeshing people's lives together. So a lot of the flows, the community garden, the way it's set up is to make people really co-live in this space. Multi-generational households are increasing. And in fact, they've quadrupled since 1971. And some of this is definitely economically driven, but some of it is also just people changing the structure of their families. And more developers are actually creating multi-generational homes now because there is a big demand and appetite for families that want the children and the parents and the grandparents and the extended family to all live together. But here's what's really interesting, and this is where it intersects with the power law. And by the way, this is based on the insight of a researcher named Toby Shorin, who's a brilliant thinker. But essentially, for the last 20 years, the tech industry functioned as a giant social laboratory. It was all these guys and all these apps up here. So social networks, forums, open source communities, creator platforms, online worlds, all these things were experiments in how people coordinate and build status, in how they relate, and how they form communities. And tech founders were the architects of our social lives. If you wanted to see where new social rules were being formed, you would look to technology. That's where you would go. But for all intents and purposes, that phase has ended because innovation is not happening on these platforms anymore. They're too profitable. Their formats and ideas and models, they've become cemented. They've hardened into infrastructure now. Where we do see innovation is in all those examples I just gave you. And all those real-world examples of people actually creating new forms of relating in the real world. And that's where the most active testing ground is. It's not in tech, it's in these care spaces. And that's the 20% that's starting to gain power. So we can't talk about power without talking about justice, especially since so many of our institutions for meting out justice have eroded at this point. And that's why you see a rise in things like vigilante justice. So police all over America are having a real problem with vigilante pedophile hunters. These are guys that will lure in predators, just like you might have seen on that show, To Catch a Predator. And they can't stream on Twitch or Discord, so they're on these alternative platforms like Locals and Rumble and Kick. And because it's socially incentivized, because you need the comments and you need the likes and the traction, these vigilante pedophile hunters have become increasingly erratic and increasingly violent, and their actions are more and more illegal. But people love this content. And you can kind of understand why, because it feels like there is a sense of justice in the world. They feel like at least the bad guy is getting caught. Now, you might not watch vigilante pedophile hunters, but if you watch Bravo TV, or if you go on social into the comments section, you get your sense of justice from there. The comments section on TV shows on social is no different than the comments section on these live streams. The comments section has become the courtroom. How many of you watch true crime and then you rush to Twitter or TikTok to see what other people thought about the husband, or what other people thought about like the person next door, or what other people thought about the sister-in-law or the mother-in-law? All of these alternative channels for justice are actually also changing our media landscape. So the reality TV that you kids watch today is very different than what I grew up with. When I grew up with reality TV, it was very simple plot lines, just people being stupid. Now, reality TV is increasingly about trauma and personal crisis and abuse, because trauma is the quickest way to create the courtroom in the comments. If you can get people to judge and defend and debate, you can get that courtroom running. And producers know this. And that's why they focus on trauma and personal crisis. These are informal justice systems that have emerged in culture. And they might not be ideal, and I'm not necessarily condoning them, but they fill a need for justice that we just don't get from our institutions right now. You may have seen an uptick in leftist and liberal influencers talking about the importance of the Second Amendment. So 2A is the common refrain. 2A shows up on social a lot. And they're talking a lot about gun rights, and some of them are getting critical about gun control. And I would argue that the moment ICE began killing without accountability, a certain kind of political future started dying. And now you have these liberal and left-leaning feeds where people are openly questioning the idea of gun control, or at least definitely talking about gun rights. The right to own and carry a gun in a time that feels especially lawless in America shows you just how far apart political discourse and people's lived realities have started to drift. And yes, more Democrats are buying guns now. In the feed, you'll see images of faith leaders on the freezing front lines of Minneapolis or in California, literally facing down ICE guns in their faces. And literally right next to that in the same feed, you will see Democratic politicians in carpeted congressional rooms posting about these small wins for gun control. Now, gun control is still very important to a lot of people. But for a lot of other people, it kind of is starting to feel like a relic from a bygone world. And this is another example of the 20% shifting. If you would ask yourself, how would you split the 80-20 when it comes to politics? Typically, it would be along party lines, but it's getting harder to figure out what these parties even look like anymore. And there's an argument to be made that maybe instead of right versus left, people are more clearly organized in top versus down. That is a sign of the 20% locus of power shifting. Can you guys feel what these memes are doing? Do you feel it? If you're familiar with quirkification or J.D. Vance memes, you'll understand what you're looking at here. So these kinds of memes are very subversive in a really specific way. They take these highly political figures and invert their stories. They invert the narrative around who these people really are. And the joke here is not the meme itself. It's this idea that audiences refuse to believe the media narrative that they are being fed by authorities. It's their way of laughing at what they are being fed as the quote-unquote truth. And this is really important because culture is basically spread through memes. It's a big part of our discourse. It's a legitimate language that carries a ton of context and meaning that our other modes of language cannot carry. So Aidan Walker is the person that has these insights. I got to interview him as well. He's a genius. Highly recommend you follow him. A lot of geniuses, I put their ideas in this deck. But he talks about how internet culture has begun to more and more seize control of public narratives. And thinkers like him describe it as meme sovereignty. So this idea that the internet now controls the image of public figures. And once a meme spreads, institutions lose the ability to control the story like they used to. And the public loves to do this with figures that really want to control their image. You could really surface or see it with the Luigi Mangione thirst trap memes. So the story was that this guy, I see the ladies smiling in the back. The story was that this guy was a killer and a criminal. But by the time you saw his photo, it was already in a meme, and it was already a thirst trap meme, and we were already talking about how hot he was. So we were being told that he was armed and dangerous, but these memes resisted that story. And for a brief moment, liberals and conservatives were very united in their hatred of the healthcare system in this country. When we turned this guy into a heartthrob, we rejected the story that was given to us about what makes somebody a criminal. So again, the locus of narrative power here is shifting. There's a principle in urban design that I know many of you are familiar with called desire paths, right? So it's briefly the idea that there are the paths we create for people, but then there are the paths that they take. And they might not always be the same paths. And this is a picture from New York. You can see the desire path was not like the paved pathway. It was cutting through other pathways. You especially see desire paths when it snows. And I would argue that right now, when it comes to our channels of power, a lot of our channels have been muted or turned off, and it's kind of like a blanket of snow over culture. And now what we're seeing is all these new desire paths, because people still want justice. They still want control of the narrative. They still want access to the connection. But without our default pathways working, we're creating new ones that are perhaps a bit more direct. And this is what I would want you to take away from this. The power law is an extremely important principle. And you should really use it whenever you want to understand culture or organize culture in your head. People, I have found, do not like to use economic principles to describe culture because they think culture is too precious, or it's too sacred, or too organic. But it's not any of those things. A lot of times, culture will act just like a market. And if you understand the principles beneath it, you can create a new future. Sometimes the 20% isn't really who you think it is. And that's why you need to pay attention. Sometimes the 20% is changing. Sometimes the 20% can be changed, but you have to make sure you understand who's in there now and who it can be replaced with. You're right, if you want power, you don't change everybody. You just change that 20%. I think a lot of the best laid plans fail because we fail to understand who is actually in the 20%, just like I did with the example I gave you at the beginning of this section. And it's because we're not taking an honest look at culture itself. But if you understand this principle, you don't have to make that mistake. So when you put all this together, all of these new life experiments and all of our new channels of power, you can see that, yes, there is an order emerging in the chaos. And these experiments might not resemble the institutions that we've seen in the past, but they are very real. And I'm not saying you necessarily have to adopt any of these things or go live like this. I'm just saying that you need to start recognizing the new world when you see it. This is a rethinking of everything. Everything from the meaning of family and community to the home and justice and safety and ownership. All of the fundamentals of culture. And all of this is in response to the monster/machine. These are everyday people that looked into the eye of the monster. And they saw what was plaguing us. And because they really looked with clear eyes, they were able to build an alternative that made sense for a lot of people. Throughout our mythologies and our religions and our fables and even our contemporary media, monsters always appear at the threshold between worlds. They test whether a society is ready to move forward or not. And the monsters we face today, the people and the systems that are so cruel and so wasteful, in some ways you could say they're performing the same function. But you have to be willing to face them. That's what we started this with, right? Nobody wants to look at this monster/machine. Nobody wants to actually face it. But if you don't face it, you're going to spend the rest of your life and the rest of your career building for a world that's dying. Now, looking directly at the monster is going to cost you something. You might have seen this Gabor Mate quote that's everywhere right now, where he says, it's impossible to have your eyes open and not have your heart broken. You have to get close to it, and you have to witness the ugliness. And I don't know what it will cost you, but I can tell you what it cost me. I looked in the Epstein files, and I cried for 2 days. My family is from Iran. I know the pain of oppression and the destruction of war. I've looked at these things in many ways that I know you guys have looked at certain things in your lives as well. And it's wounded me. I really mean that. It's wounded me. I don't think I'm going to be the same person ever again. But I don't think I want to be the same person ever again. Because that person was sleepwalking into a mirage that isn't going to last much longer. And if you want to build for this new future, there's just no way around it. This is kind of a cost you have to pay. And it doesn't always have to look like what I just showed you, by the way. These are just some examples. I could talk for hours about all the ways that people are building the future. And there's so many ways that haven't started yet. You can build it in your own way. You all have different vantage points and different positions. It will look different for everybody. There's a study that came out a few years ago that I've never forgotten about what happens when you take a picture of something. So when you take a picture of a moment, your brain does not encode it with as much fidelity as if you had not taken the picture. And it makes sense, because our brains are always trying to conserve energy. It's an energy-conserving organ. And so it knows you're taking the picture, so it's not going to encode it with as much detail in your memory as it would have otherwise. We take pictures of everything now. Think of how much fidelity we have outsourced to our phones. And the point is this: you're never really gonna see the things that you choose to see through a filter. You're never really gonna see the things that you choose to see through somebody else's point of view. You're never really gonna see the things that you choose to see from a distance. I would argue that those are all ways of looking away, which is exactly what the monster/machine is compelling us to do. To observe something, you have to give it your full, unadulterated attention. Simone Weil once wrote that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. When systems tell us to look away, attention really does become an act of courage. The job of creators and designers and thinkers is to witness what is actually happening, but witness both the darkness and the light. You have to be very deliberate about where your attention goes. Sometimes people look at all of this darkness and they get lost in it, and they get very hopeless about the future. Other people don't look at it because they don't want to become hopeless. You have to deliberately focus on both sides. You have to see what is wrong in the world, but you also have to see what is right in the world. And I think the greatest creators are able to hold both of those realities at the same time. I monitor a lot of spaces and a lot of Slacks and Discords, and this is just anecdotal, but I can tell you from what I've seen in the Mamasphere to the fangirl universe to religious pastors in deeply red states to wellness gurus and alien hunters and preppers and doomers and economists and the climate community, everybody sees collapse coming. But collapse doesn't mean disaster. It means that things aren't going to look the way that they used to look. What's actually dying is the old world and the old way of doing things. And that brings me to my last piece of advice. As cheesy as it sounds, you will have to stay optimistic about what's possible and keep moving forward, because you already know this. You can only build from a place of optimism. All of the things that I just showed you, those were all very optimistic creations. Many people sense that something in our world is ending. It doesn't take a genius. You're not a genius for thinking that something is going to shift. But they don't see that the new world is already being built inside of the old one, through these experiments in community and work and governance and culture and relationship. And the road ahead is going to be bumpy. We're just going to be very honest about that. The next decades are going to be bumpy. But the room for possibility is just tremendous. The appetite for change and experimentation is just so huge. There is this incredible, raw, charged energy and culture right now that you can channel, that you get to work with. And you get to decide what future exists in that regard. I think that's something to be very excited about. So thank you.